Marvel's Bronze Age introduced far more than classic storylines. It created characters that once seemed destined for greatness. Heroes, villains, and anti-heroes debuted with bold ideas, memorable powers, and major roles in an era that reshaped comic books forever. But as the Marvel Universe evolved, many of them quietly slipped into obscurity. Some were overshadowed by bigger stars, others abandoned by changing editorial priorities, and a few simply stopped appearing altogether. They weren't forgotten because they lacked potential. They were left behind by history. But which Bronze Age characters disappeared the most? Here are 10 Bronze Age characters Marvel wants you to forget. At number 10 is Ulysses Bloodstone. In the 1970s, the easing of the comics code authority triggered a massive horror boom, and Marvel capitalized on this zeitgeist by introducing Ulysses Bloodstone, created by Len Wein, Marv Wolfman, and John Warner, as a rugged, pulp-style monster hunter to navigate their darker universe. For a while, Marvel invested heavily in him, giving him a grand, millennia-spanning lore centered around his quest for the Blood Gem and featuring him prominently in Rampaging Hulk and Marvel Presents. His future looked incredibly promising as the absolute focal point of their supernatural wing. But the Great White Hunter Adventurer trope aged out fast. As the monster boom collapsed and superhero stories shifted toward complex psychological drama, a straightforward immortal caveman shooting Draculas felt hopelessly one-dimensional and painfully stuck in another era. Marvel quietly retired the boomer hunter, eventually killing him off and handing the franchise to his modern, snarky daughter, Elsa Bloodstone. At number 9 is Razorback. In the late 1970s, the CB radio and trucker culture craze swept the nation. Marvel capitalized by bringing in Archie Goodwin, Bill Mantlo, and Sal Buscema to create a mutant trucker vigilante wearing a giant electrified boar's head. Framed as a comedic supporting player, he debuted in Spectacular Spider-Man, possessing the unique mutant ability to intuitively drive any vehicle, even hijacking and piloting a NASA spaceship. But the CB radio fad evaporated quickly. A hero whose entire identity and lingo revolved around big rigs felt hopelessly out of place as comics grew grittier. Once the trucker fad died, he was completely outclassed by the escalating threats of the Marvel Universe. Today, he has been sidelined to obscure cameos and visual gags, surviving just enough in the cult classic background to score a random Marvel Legends action figure, but remaining miles away from any mainstream relevance inside modern comic book continuity. At number 8 is Moon Boy. In the late 1970s, comics experimented heavily with bizarre sci-fi, lost worlds, and primitive themes, fueled by a returning Jack Kirby who loved esoteric, wild concepts. Moon Boy perfectly represented this specific cultural zeitgeist Marvel wanted to capture during the Bronze Age. As the co-star of Devil Dinosaur, he was positioned as the human anchor to a bizarre 9-issue niche run that struggled to find its footing. For a while, Marvel invested heavily in him, making his future in the universe look incredibly promising. The reality was that a screaming cave boy and a giant red dinosaur struggled to maintain narrative weight as Marvel shifted toward mature, interconnected superhero dramas. The gimmick had a short shelf life, and the character started feeling painfully stuck in another era. Marvel eventually beat Moon Boy to death in the comics just to clear the deck and pair Devil Dinosaur with Lunella Lafayette. If you think a screaming cave boy was a bizarre misstep, wait until you see the hidden history Marvel tried to push next. Coming up, we have a blatant attempt to rip off Batman, a surreal indie experiment abruptly murdered, a dimensional castaway, and a genetically engineered monstrosity that aged terribly. At number 7 is the Shroud. Tapping into the era's fascination with mysticism, martial arts, and wealthy playboy vigilantes, Marvel essentially tried to create their own mystical, darkened version of Batman. The Shroud perfectly represented the specific cultural zeitgeist Marvel wanted to capture during the Bronze Age. Introduced prominently in major crossover comic events, he was heavily tied to Doctor Doom, given his own short solo run, and deeply woven into the West Coast Avengers orbit. For a while, Marvel invested heavily in him, making his future look incredibly promising. The problem? The niche of a blind martial arts vigilante was already completely dominated by Daredevil. Without a unique hook, his confusing brand of vigilante justice, pretending to be a mob boss to stop crime, became incredibly repetitive. Daredevil completely cannibalized his market share, permanently exiling him to the D-list. At number 6 is Omega the Unknown. The mid-70s saw a massive wave of weird existential counterculture storytelling sweep through the comic industry. Instead of traditional heroes punching villains, Marvel experimented with surreal, slow-burn narratives focusing heavily on deep philosophy. Created by Steve Gerber and Mary Skrenes, Omega received a highly praised, bizarre 10-issue solo series. It was presented as a thoughtful mystery deliberately meant to subvert standard superhero tropes. However, its avant-garde vibe clashed with the mainstream market. But the true downfall was behind the scenes. Escalating editorial warfare between the creators and Marvel's Jim Shooter led to severe delays and Gerber's eventual firing. With Gerber and Skrenes refusing to reveal their planned ending, Marvel handed the messy aftermath to writer Steve Grant. To quickly clean the slate, Grant unceremoniously killed Omega off in the Defenders. Today, this fascinating hidden history remains a controversial casualty of brutal industry politics that Marvel would rather ignore. At number 5 is Skull the Slayer. The 1970s experienced a massive obsession with the Bermuda Triangle and UFOs. Marvel wanted a hero trapped in a lost dimension of temporal anomalies, and Skull the Slayer perfectly represented the specific cultural zeitgeist Marvel wanted to capture during the Bronze Age. He was given his own titular solo series, dropping a troubled Vietnam veteran into a wild world of dinosaurs, aliens, and ruins. For a while, Marvel invested heavily in him, making his future look incredibly promising. But the second the mainstream Bermuda Triangle fad evaporated, the concept of a guy wearing a superpower-granting alien scorpion belt running around with primitive weapons felt incredibly cheesy and disconnected. This is exactly where the character started feeling painfully stuck in another era. His solo title was scrapped, and he was permanently banished to the background of obscure alternate dimensions. At number 4 is Woodgod. Drawing heavily from 70s genetic engineering paranoia and Planet of the Apes-style human-animal sci-fi, Marvel created a tragic, Frankenstein-esque outcast. Premiering in the Marvel premiere, Woodgod was positioned as a major new sympathetic monster. He was given team-ups with heavy hitters like Spider-Man and the Hulk to legitimize his presence. For a while, Marvel invested heavily in him, making his future in the universe look incredibly promising. The clunky half-man, half-satyr design, and the heavy-handed man-playing god tropes felt incredibly dated by the time the gritty, mutant-focused 80s rolled around. But this is exactly where the character started feeling painfully stuck in another era. Today, he's nothing more than a trivia answer for deep-cut comic historians. We are down to the final 3, and these are the industry failures that hurt the most. Stick around to see an impossibly complex cosmic hero, a ruthless vigilante completely erased by the Punisher, and our number 1 spot. A character stripped of his mythos and demoted forever. At number 3 is the original 3D man. In the late 1970s, a massive wave of 1950s nostalgia swept through entertainment. Marvel capitalized on this by creating an homage to classic sci-fi and 3D movies featuring two brothers who merged into a single Avenger. Starring in a brief 3-issue run of Marvel Premiere, he fought alien Skrull infiltrators with a very unique visual gimmick. But the heavy reliance on mid-century nostalgia and the clunky mechanic of two brothers sharing one superhero body quickly lost appeal. That thin original run flopped instantly. While Marvel eventually built a massive Skrull hunting mythology during the Secret Invasion event, they bolted that lore directly onto his modern successor, Delroy Garrett. The first 3D man was left completely behind, buried so deep he became an obscure Bronze Age footnote that Marvel hopes you will just permanently forget as they quietly build a new legacy around his successor instead. At number 2 is Foolkiller. Inspired by 1970s films like Taxi Driver, there was a massive boom in gritty, street-level vigilante stories focusing on urban decay. Marvel wanted an unhinged executioner who punished societal fools. Greg Salinger perfectly represented this specific cultural zeitgeist they wanted to capture during the Bronze Age. Featured prominently as a darkly comedic, puritanical vigilante in Omega the Unknown and The Defenders, he was positioned as a serious reflection of real-world urban madness. For a while, Marvel invested heavily in him, making his future look incredibly promising. Ultimately, the gimmick of an insane man punishing fools with a purification gun was quickly overshadowed. When the 1980s arrived, the Punisher completely cornered the market on lethal street-level vigilantes, rendering Foolkiller totally redundant. This is exactly where the character started feeling painfully stuck in another era. The Punisher's meteoric rise in the 80s instantly cornered the market on lethal street justice, wiping Salinger's entire archetype off the map. At number 1 is Man-Wolf. With the 70s Universal Monsters revival in full swing, Marvel ingeniously turned J. Jonah Jameson's astronaut son, John, into a tragic lunar beast. This character perfectly represented the specific cultural zeitgeist Marvel wanted to capture during the Bronze Age. Starring in Creatures on the Loose, he received a deep-lore space werewolf saga, promoted as a standalone star capable of carrying a weird sci-fi and horror hybrid mythos. It didn't last. The strange mashup of a NASA astronaut meeting a high fantasy space werewolf aged out fast. As Marvel naturally separated horror from sci-fi, Man-Wolf lost his distinct niche. This is exactly where the character started feeling painfully stuck in another era. Stripped of his leading man status, he was permanently demoted back to Spider-Man's supporting cast. These Bronze Age characters deserve another chance. Comment your favorite forgotten character and press the subscribe now and turn on notifications for more Marvel content.